David McMullen, who was Ellen Dawson?
Ellen Dawson was a woman who was born in Scotland in 1900, comes to the United States in 1921 when she becomes a leading communist labor activist, and is the first woman ever elected to a national leadership position in an American textile union. She's born in Scotland in 1900 in a place called Barrhead, which is industrial village on the outskirts of Glasgow. Working class poverty. I mean, her family is at the lowest level. Her mother's family, to give you an idea, in 1890, there were 12 people living in a two-room house. This kind of poverty is difficult for us in the United States to even imagine today. But that's the kind of poverty she came from. It was normal in Britain at that time for children to go to school until they were 13 years old. And then when they graduated from what we would call elementary school, they would go on and go to work. And so she, at the age of 13, goes to work in a textile mill in Scotland. And she spends almost her entire life in a textile mill. She's a textile worker from the age of 13 until the age of 65, when she retires and comes to Florida and dies the next year of a disease that is attributable, lung disease, attributed to having worked in textile mills. It's also fascinating because she's 13 in 1914, which is when World War I begins. And so the period in Glasgow and in Scotland between about 1910 and 1920, particularly during World War I, is a time known as Red Clydeside. It is a very turbulent time in terms of labor history. There are all sorts of radicals that are part of the labor movement there, from cooperative people who are socialist, a very, not at all really radical. I mean, they're just talking about alternatives to capitalism, to the extreme of communists who were very vocal after the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. And so even though I can't find any record of her being involved in any of this labor unrest, she's clearly exposed to it, and she's exposed to the ideas that were part of that time period. So I would say that's when she gets the radical ideas that are in her head. She doesn't become a communist until 1926, when she's working as in Passaic, New Jersey, and they start the strike there. But it's during this time that I think she's exposed to it. After World War I, there's massive unemployment in Britain. Within weeks after the end of the war, more than 500,000 women lost their jobs because of the end of the war munitions. The textile industry had been pretty much on hold during World War I because of the difficulty bringing in cotton and other materials to fuel the textile mills. But after the war, there's this belief, okay, we're going to be able to crank up our textile industry again. This doesn't hold true, because what happens is the United States and several other countries have stolen Britain's markets for their textile goods, and so the textile industry in Britain never recovers from World War I. But there's this brief period right after the war where there's new investment and so on, and so her entire family, with the exception of maybe 2 people, moved south to a little village outside of Manchester. It's Shawforth and Millgate, and there they have just momentary prosperity. But then it collapses, and she and one of her brothers lead the family to the United States. They come over in 1921 and get established in Passaic, New Jersey. She immediately goes to work on the night shift in the Botany Worsted Mill, which, interestingly, at the time, even though there were lots of women working on the night shift, it was against the law for women to work the night shift in New Jersey. No one enforced it. But they are able to bring her younger siblings and her mother over. Her father dies before they're able to get over him. He dies while she's in the U.S. And it's from that, working in the textile mills, that she just happens to be at the place where there's this massive textile strike Passaic is fascinating because it's a city that's always been a city of immigrants. Uh, in the 1920s, the textile mill owners would send representatives to Ellis Island to hire people of different ethnicities so that and who spoke different languages, so that they couldn't organize unions in the textile mills because they couldn't talk to each other. And so in 1926, there are more than 35 different languages spoken in the textile mills of Passaic, New Jersey. And I wondered, is that still true? And I went and looked recently, and there are more than 30 different languages spoken in Passaic High School today. Now, obviously, there are different languages. There are different ethnic groups that have come over from to Passaic, but it's still very much a fascinating town for immigrant workers, or at least half of it is. One half was very posh in the 1920s. The people who lived there often worked in New York City, took the train in. I mean, they had these big homes with the large porches and things like that. But then the bulk of the population lived in a very densely populated area, close to the textile mills. Her house was maybe 2 blocks from the mill where she worked. She was a leading woman in the labor movement in the second half of the 1920s. She's involved in 3 major textile strikes. The first one in Passaic, New Jersey, where she lives and works as a weaver in the Botany Worsted Mill there in Passaic. That strike lasts about a year and a half, and ultimately they're successful. The workers are successful. From that, she becomes an activist in a lot of different areas. She's involved in the protest against the execution of Sacco and Vanzetti. She is a speaker at several of the International Women's Day celebrations in New York City. She is part of a women's delegation that goes to Russia to evaluate the women in Russia versus women in the United States, and they come back and issue a rather fascinating report. I think in reality, when you look at it carefully, there was a bit of bamboozling going on when they were in Russia, because their picture of the women in Russia was not totally accurate. Although when they came back and looked at the role that many working class women had in the United States, it was pretty appalling in the 1920s. Then she becomes a true labor activist. She's involved in the big textile strike in New Bedford, Massachusetts in 1928. During that strike, she ultimately, when the strike ends, and that strike's unsuccessful, she is arrested by the police chief one more time, and in the newspaper interview he asked her how many times she'd been arrested, and she said, "So many times I've lost count." From that, she goes to continue work in the textile movement, labor movement in Massachusetts. But 1929 is really sort of the culmination of her career. She begins by attending the AFL, United Textile Workers Union meeting, of which she's a delegate, and being expelled because she's a communist. That's the first part. From that, she helps to organize a new textile union with more than 100,000 workers across the country. And in that union, the National Textile Workers Union, she is elected vice president at the national level. So at that point, she achieves that particular goal. She then is involved in the 1929 Communist Party convention, which is a sort of a watershed convention for the Communist Party, because up until that time, the Communist Party had been several different parties that were not working together. And at that convention, they sort of solidify it. They rename themselves the Communist Party USA. They take a focus where their primary concern is the workers of America. It's really a workers' party. So she's involved in that. Then almost immediately after that, she's sent to Gastonia, North Carolina, where the third of the 3 strikes in which she's involved. She's the co-director of the strike there. She's the first union speaker to speak to the workers in Gastonia. And in Gastonia, it becomes it's the least successful, and it's also the most violent in terms of the fact that 2 people are killed in Gastonia. The police chief is killed, what's his name? Orville Adderholt. Although the Union people are blamed for it, there's just as much evidence that one of his own men probably shot him in the back. There's a single woman textile worker, Ella Mae Wiggins, who is also killed by vigilantes during the strike. She remains today as a bit of a character from the time, and nobody has ever really written about her, which is unfortunate. Was a poet. She wrote a variety of poetry. Most famous is the Mill Mother's Lament, talking about the suffering of a mother who must leave her children while she goes and works 12 hours a day, 6 days a week in a textile mill. Ultimately, in the 1960s or 70s, Pete Seeger turned that to music, and so the Mill Mother's Lament is also a Pete Seeger song at the time. From the textile strike in Gastonia, the government tries to deport her because, remember, she's a Scottish immigrant. She is forced to go back to New Jersey just prior to the shooting of the police chief, so she misses out on a lot of that, which from her point was positive, but from the historical point of view was somewhat negative because she's been ignored by most of the historians who've looked at the Gastonia strike or even the other two strikes. Anyway, they try to deport her. Unfortunately, the judge in New Jersey says this is ridiculous, this is a trumped up charge, and throws it out. And so as a result, she retains her U.S. citizenship. Now, what's fascinating about this is that many of her associates, including a fellow who was from, William Murdoch, who was from Scotland too, is deported, but at a later period of time. And they're deported because of the Red Scare. There were people that she worked with in the 1920s that are deported in 1950, and their only connection to the Communist Party was they were in a textile strike in Massachusetts in 1928. But it was, it made great publicity for the government to throw out all of these individuals. The reason she's not deported, I think, is because in 1935 or 36, she marries a Hungarian, and so her last name changes dramatically from Ellen Dawson to Ellen Kanke. And when I found her obituary in the paper, it just said Mrs. Lewis Kanke, Scotland native. No mention whatsoever of all of her radical activities, but yes, this is Passaic, New Jersey, where she has been involved in all of that. So it's kind of fascinating that she sort of gets hidden away or tucked away, and I think in the long run is why she survived. In the 1930s, remember the 1930s is the Great Depression. Most workers are struggling to survive. I think from what I can tell, she stops being a radical as early as 1931. That's the last time I can find any reference to her being involved in any kind of labor activity whatsoever. There's at least one historian who says she remains part of this spin-off group of the Communist Party until around 1940, but I'm not sure that's really true. What happens is at the end of 1929, remember we talked about the Communist Party convention at the beginning. Well, the guy who's head of the Communist Party USA is a fascinating fellow by the name of J. Lovestone, and he goes to Russia to meet with Stalin. And his attitude was, okay, I'm head of the Communist Party of the United States, so that makes me on an equal level with Stalin, who's head of the Communist Party in Russia, which was a major mistake. Because it's 1929 is when Stalin starts solidifying his power internationally and uses the Comintern, which Lenin had started, to take control of communism worldwide. And so old J. Lovestone is really fortunate to get out of Russia. Fortunately had a couple of friends who were in the military who were able to smuggle him out. Otherwise he would have probably been killed in Russia in 1929. Anyway, he gets back to the United States and he is persona non grata. Stalin has taken control of the Communist Party. Lovestone is thrown out. So are his primary supporters, and Ellen Dawson was one of his primary supporters. So she's thrown out of the Communist Party in 1929 and thrown out of the National Textile Workers Union as well. So 29 was a big year for her getting thrown out of things, the two labor unions and the Communist Party USA. They form another group called the Communist Party USA Majority Group, which the the term majority group is really a joke because they never were probably more than 500 people at the most, if that, where the other part of the Communist Party was hundreds of thousands, or at least tens of thousands. What we see is that in the 1930s, the Communist Party goes underground. And the communist aspect of this is really fascinating because during the Cold War, historians really couldn't write sympathetic views of communists, American communists, because all communists were bad and evil. And it's not to say that there are some communists out there who weren't very bad and very evil, because there certainly were. But there were others that were, whose heart was in the right place. Joy Davidman, who was the American wife of the British philosopher C.S. Lewis, who wrote things like The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. She once said that back in those days, everybody was either a communist or a fascist. If you were a fascist, you wanted to rule the world. If you were a communist, you wanted to save the world. And that's pretty much Ellen Dawson's approach. She was concerned about the plight of the average worker, particularly the textile worker. I mean, these people were working 60 hours a week, getting paid salaries today that don't even seem realistic. I mean, a family living on $14 a week, a family of 4 in Gastonia, North Carolina, $14 a week, of which most of the money went back to the company to pay for the company house and the company food and stuff like that. It was a terrible time for a lot of American workers, and I think her focus was trying to help those workers, and that's why I think her story was important.
How did you hear about her, and what made you want to write a book about her?
Well, I was living in North Carolina. I was living in a small town about 20 miles from Gastonia, and John Salmon's book, Gastonia 1929, which is the best book about that particular strike, came out, and I read the book, and I was fascinated by it. And I went down and took a look at the old mill, which is abandoned now. And I was looking for something to write about that would allow me to do research both in the United States and in Scotland. And my wife, I had missed it. My wife said, "Oh, why don't you write about Ellen Dawson? Because she's Scottish." And sure enough, went back, and there's just this one mention of her being Scottish. And so I started exploring her. And she makes cameo appearances, if you will, in several books about the 3 strikes she's involved in and women's labor during this period in time. But nobody had ever focused on her. So I thought, okay, this is a good idea. And the more I learned about her, the more fascinating I became fascinated with her as a person, because, she's, as a labor historian, labor historians often don't necessarily get to focus on the winners. We get to focus sometimes on the losers. But the losers still tell us an awful lot about the world, and the ideas that they presented are maybe valid today, because as one famous labor historian, E.P. Thompson, said, we haven't resolved all the problems of society yet. And so maybe some of their ideas just got overlooked. So I got fascinated with her, and so ultimately to do this book, I did research in 35 different libraries or archives on 2 continents in 3 countries, the United States, England, and Scotland, and places everywhere from the British Library to the Library of Congress to probably the most fascinating place was this little local history museum in a little village just north of Manchester. And I had discovered it on the internet, and I was going down there, and there were like 4 or 5 places I was going to do research. So this place was only open on Wednesday nights and Sunday afternoons. So I was there waiting for them to open a Wednesday night. And it turned out it was just old guys that lived in the village that had put together this little museum of their world. I mean, at one point, one guy took me and he says it was the certificate of the cradle roll, where churches used to, each new baby, they'd put their name and everything. He said, "See that one? That's my name, and the one above it is my brother. We were the last 2 that they ever did in the church." Well, so I go and I tell them what I'm doing, and I said, there are 2 things I really need to know. One is, when was she here? How long, when did they come? How long did they stay and when did they leave? And I'm trying to find out what happened to her father because the British Public Records Office was supposed to have all the death records, but they didn't. And the guy said, okay. He said, we've got the rent books. And he takes me over to the shelf and he pulls out these big leather-bound volumes and opens them up, one for each year, and it's every place, residence in the village, who lived there, when they moved in, all of the details. So I found out exactly when they got there, where they lived, all of that. And then I said, her father, he just disappears. He said, oh, we got the death records. So he pulls out this another little book and I go through it. Sure enough, there he's there. He's right there. And so the two most important pieces of information I needed from that area, those guys had saved. And he said, and you know what? When the village council closed, instead of sending all these records to the public records office, which is what they're supposed to do, they threw them in the dumpster. And he said, I want you to meet the guy who climbed into the dumpster and rescued these books. And so as a historian, that's the challenge, is that so much of it doesn't survive, and some of it that does survive is just by pure luck. But that was one of the two most important experiences for me that I had. The other was I discovered her, when I started this, I said, I want to find out where this woman is buried. I want to track it down. And it was the eve of her 104th birthday. I'm in Lodi, I guess it's called, which is adjacent to Passaic. And I'd gone to St. Nicholas, which is the church where she went to church, where she was married, where a funeral was held, and all of it in Passaic. Thinking, being from the South, I thought, okay, there'll be a churchyard right beside it. Oh no, not in New Jersey. They have these enormous churches, like 5 football fields for one church. So I go to Lodi and I find the cemetery, and there's no guide to where it is. So I'm wandering around. It's getting close to dark. It's below freezing. I'm wrapped up with everything I can. I'm just wandering around looking for the gravestone. And finally I'm at a point where I just cannot stand the cold anymore, and it's almost dark. So I said, I can't do it. And just at that point I saw her grave, Big Dawson. And it turns out it's the grave of her mother and her and 2 of her sisters. And so I went over and I stood there, and it shows, I think, the kind of emotion that for me and the fascination I had with this woman. I said, my lips numb and really having difficulty talking, I said, I want to introduce myself. I'm David McMullen. I'm your biographer, and I just wanted to promise that you will not be forgotten. And that's really why I wrote this book, is because here was a woman, a fascinating woman, a woman who should not be forgotten, who had, as I said, just got cameo appearances in several books about the events she was involved in, but nobody had ever focused on her. And to me, that's what makes this book special, is the fact that this is a really fascinating woman, and her story deserved to be told. And so, that's why I did it.